Welcome back, everyone. Sorry for the technical difficulties. We had just started talking to Deborah Madison on her book, An Onion in My Pocket, and I'd asked her, for someone who is in fact known for extensive expertise and having written widely on vegetable cookery, she has a long chapter in the book where she talks about my vegetarian problem. And Deborah, you were just beginning to articulate what is that problem?
Okay. Actually, I wanted to call the book My Vegetarian Problem, but it ended up just being the chapter. I learned a lot about food that ordinary people eat by eating meat. And I learned about texture. I learned about muscle and qualities like that. And so I didn't want anyone to jump through a hoop. For me, I was just glad to be invited to anyone's house for dinner. They could serve burned carrots as far as I was concerned. It didn't really matter. And I also know from being a cooking teacher for over 20 years that people can change, that they do change, that a vegetarian can dream of turkey. People can hunger for meat, or they might want to give it up or see an alternative, or they can get sick and want to have meat if that's what they grew up on. That's my husband's situation with cancer. You never know what's going to happen, so why say this or that? Also, vegetarians can be very obnoxious. I once posted on Facebook about a meal that was going to take place to benefit SWGLA, which is the Southwest Grass-Fed Livestock Alliance. And there was going to be beef, grass-fed beef there. And somebody responded with, "Oh, you're going to eat a dead cow. Boy, that's fun." And it's true, it was a dead cow, but it didn't take in the context, the bigger context of where we live. And I felt that that was important to include. And also it was because of this dead cow that the rancher in New Mexico had jumped through huge hoops to get water on her land by redoing her roads, by digging up juniper trees by the roots and so forth and so on, which benefited not only the cattle, but wildlife and grasses. She went from one native grass to 40 grasses. So it was important. And also the meal was going to feature meat that was not chops and steaks and that sort of thing. So those are just a few of the reasons, but they're sweet and good vegetarians too. And I do talk about them.
Excellent. And I'm going to ask you another question just to give you a little more time, because we disrupted you so often because of technical difficulties. And that'll be a segue to Tom, in fact. In the book you write, there's a kind of a poignant part of the book where you say that California, in some ways, the beauty of the California landscape receded for you a bit when you saw the mean housing for the workers working the lettuce fields. Could you take us a bit to that moment?
Sure.
And where you are now about it? Because that links to this larger question of, can we have good food without social justice?
It does. It does. I went to school at UC Santa Cruz, and I used to go for rides on my motorcycle in the nearby Salinas Valley. And it was so beautiful, and it was often foggy, and it softened the edges of the landscape, and the way snow can make everything beautiful. And it also hid the skull and crossbone signs that were posted in the artichoke fields, which referred to the pesticides that were used on them at that time. Anyway, one day a classmate invited several of us to go look at workers' housing. And it was so mean and so dangerous. There were no bathrooms, there were no kitchen, the water was from a hose that went into buckets that had recently held pesticides. And after that experience, I could never see the agricultural landscape in the same way, nor could I eat food that was growing in that way. I couldn't eat the greens that came from those fields, and I didn't really want to eat any mass-produced food ever again. And I think in some ways that led to my interest in local agriculture and in fairness in food.
Excellent, beautifully put. Tom, that's kind of a lovely segue. I have to say, your book was terrifying for me because I didn't realize the kind of a whiplash between lack of water and too much water, for instance. I had not made that association. And And you organize the book around two hotspots. You say the Central Valley, California, and then Midwest. And first, why these two places? What's going on in these two places that the audience should be attentive to what you say about these two places?
Well, I mean, I think the first thing is that most of what we eat in this country comes from these two places. A huge portion of what we eat comes from those two places. The Central Valley, of course, Deborah's got a great section on the Central Valley in her book. She grew up near there or in there, and it's where fruits and vegetables come from, and along with nuts. And if you live on the West Coast, your milk and beef come from, essentially feedlots there. So it's this incredibly important source of food for the entire country. And the Midwest, if you're a meat eater, unless you have a really specialized way that you get your meat, your meat comes from animals raised on corn and soybeans grown in the Midwest, centered on Iowa. And so what I do in the book is I just tease out the sort of ongoing slow motion ecological crises that are haunting both of these areas that don't get nearly enough attention, I think. And so I want to focus people's attention on these crises.
And you say in the book that in some ways the burden of that ecological crisis is right now faced by the workers who are working the system, but it is coming for all of us. Could you give us an example a bit about what the workers are facing and what is coming for the rest of us?
Yeah, so, basically, if you go to those areas, if you go to the San Joaquin Valley, which is the southern part of the Central Valley, and you just sort of drive around and look around and talk to people, what you'll find is that these are, it's an incredibly difficult place to live. Air pollution rates are among the highest in California and therefore in the country. The water is of generally terrible quality. You got people who are farm workers making less than $20,000 a year, paying thousands of dollars for bottled water because the water that they get access to is poisoned. A similar situation plays out in the middle of the Corn Belt. There are these giant factory hog farms that pollute the air. Water quality throughout the area is awful. There is literally, fecal chloroforms in the rivers and lakes. High nitrate levels, once again, terrible air quality near these things. And so, right now, the punishing consequences of this system are really being borne by the people who live in them and work in them and deliver our food. And, agriculture isn't super labor intensive in the Corn Belt, with the exception of these meat packing plants that we've been hearing a lot about recently. But it's incredibly labor intensive in general in California. And so it's the workers that are putting food on our tables that are, essentially paying the price of these ecological crises. And why they're coming for all of us and why we all have to think about them is that ultimately, basically sort of the capitalist system of agriculture that we have is literally consuming the ecological basis of food production in those areas and essentially wringing it out. And we're going to lose it unless we do something fast. And the bounty that we have, grown accustomed to in the supermarket and fast food joints, all of that is at peril unless we make some changes fast. And I think workers and people who live in those areas are the canaries in the coal mine.
And so that's the referencing back to your title, right? Perilous Bounty. That's the bounty we're sitting on, but it's kind of on the edge. Excellent. Thank you. Saru, welcome. We are talking about your book, beautiful book, brilliant structure of the book, by the way, where in each section, one chapter kind of poses the problem and question of exploitation of nature or people or animals. And then the other one, in some ways, points to an organization, a movement that is trying to deal with it. In fact, that often answers the complaints my students have, which is a lot of stuff we read is critical and analytical, but we often don't give. So what are people doing to counter this, okay? So could you explain to our audience a bit this brilliant structure? It is brilliant in a sense that it's obvious once you do it. And take one example, maybe labor as an example, or any example you want to take, the structure of the book around one of the issues.
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks to the Book Festival for having me and us, and thanks to Marion for writing the foreword in the book, and Tom and Deborah for writing everything that you write about, and Krishnendu for everything you do. So thanks, everybody. It's great to be with you on a Sunday morning. So the structure of the book really was born from my personal frustration, and I think a lot of people that in the food space, I've always said food and food labor have a lot to learn and gain from one another. I think the food space, not food labor, but people who think about, vegetarianism and pesticides and health and everything, they have reached, I think that space has reached broad audiences, but has not achieved the political power needed to change those things. Whereas in the labor space, I think we may not have reached culturally kind of the broad audiences, but we have a lot more political power to change things, which is evidenced by the Fight for 15 and just so many other things examples I could give. And so there's a lot to learn from one another and share. And so we wanted to create a book in which we not only shared, we've got all of these, to me, I hope at this point, we've all come to agreement across different aspects of the food system that corporate control of our democracy is at the root of pretty much all of the problems that we talk about across the food system. Hopefully we've all reached that agreement, but the question is then what do you do about it? And from my experience from the labor world, there is no greater way to push back against corporate control of our democracy than to build the power of the people to go up against that corporate control. There is no other way in the history of the world. There has been no other way except for the masses, for the people to rise up against corporate control, corporate domination of our democracy and our food system. And so we wanted to provide live examples so that we got rid of this feeling of helplessness. Really, it's a feeling of helplessness across the food system that corporations control our food, and there's not very little that we can do about it except maybe buying differently, eating differently, purchasing differently, which Marion has said so beautifully, is great, but it's only one muscle. We have that food muscle, that consumer muscle, but what about our muscle as people, as not just, I won't even say citizens, but as people who have the ability to speak up regardless of our immigration status or anything else. We have the ability to organize. And I think a lot of the lack of ability of the food world broadly, or the I won't even say lack of ability, but the lack of organizing across the food space just come maybe from a understanding of what is organizing. People use that word organizing so loosely and broadly. But organizing, I teach social movements and organizing at UC Berkeley. It is something that's been studied for a long time, for decades. There are whole schools of organizing. This is a skill and a profession like any other, like law or medicine or anything else. It takes years to become a skilled organizer. And I just will say one more thing just before I shut up, which is that I think this moment with the pandemic, if this moment hasn't proven to us the effectiveness and importance of organizing, a pandemic, a national call for racial equity, the transformation of our national conversation about race through masses of people in the street, I don't know what will. This moment demonstrates the need for people to rise up more than any other moment. And the thing that's heartening me the most is, as a labor organizer, I've never seen food workers rise up in the way that they're doing right now. In the 20 years that I've been organizing, I organize in the restaurant industry. Restaurant workers are striking. On Wednesday, we had strikes in 4 cities across the country. I've never seen that. They're saying we won't go back without a full, fair minimum wage. And this is amazing. And it's what I think is needed not only in labor, but across the food system.
Well, that's kind of beautifully put, especially that was new where you said, where the labor movements have, you're saying, have such an impact on the system, while the rest of the food folks have an impact in culture, and the convergence between the two is coming, and we can see versions of it. So that's a perfect way to think about Marion's chapter on conversation. Marion, on you have talked for a long time about voting with the fork, voting with your vote. How do you see, how should we be thinking about, in responding to the question, what should we do right now?
Well, right now the answer is easy. We need to vote and make sure that everybody else votes too. So the vote with your fork idea, and let me just say, I'm also very happy to be here with four people whose work I admire extravagantly. And it's just so funny because I wrote blurbs for Tom and Deborah's book and the forward to Saru's, but these are outstanding books. And I mean, we're so lucky in the food movement to have people doing the kind of writing that's going on now. But I talk a lot about voting with your fork, which means making personal food choices consistent with your values. So that if you really think that local, sustainable, seasonal, organic food is important, that's the kind of food you should be buying. I've been criticized a lot for that. Because it's so personal, when what really needs to happen is to get political. And the power of the book that Saru did is that it has a manual in it of what you should do to be politically active. And this year, beyond any other year, the issue about what people should be doing is really simple. Go to the polls on November 3rd. Make sure you're registered. Make sure everybody is registered and vote. And then beyond that, we take up the food system issues. I'm teaching a course this semester on food systems and the coronavirus. And boy, is there plenty to talk about. The issues that come up in all of the books of the people on this panel, come up in Krish's books and everybody else's books, are talking about issues of low-wage workers, of what needs to happen in schools, of what individuals can do to try to improve the food system in their communities. And these are the kinds of things that are possible to do. It's possible for individuals to make a difference, and everybody should be working on them. Now is the time.
Excellent. So it's in some ways a combination of eat right, vote, organize, and transform in some ways democracy. So I'm going to take one more, I'll give one more question to Marion, then we're going to come back to Deborah. Marion, another complicated issue, which is the question of waste. And it's a beautiful chapter. I really enjoyed reading it. Partly, there you see your stellar role, bringing a complicated issue, clarity to a complicated issue, and getting the politics right. So how should we be thinking about waste in the current?
Waste is part of the food system from the get-go. I mean, to me, the most powerful figures are the Department of Agriculture's analysis of where food waste comes in the system. 70% of it is at the production level. 70%. 20% is at the consumer level. So there's lots we could do to buy more efficiently and make better food choices. But the real problem is with the food production system, which individuals don't have that much control over. We have a food production system that is designed to be wasteful. We produce roughly twice the number of calories needed per capita, 4,000 per person per capita per day. And that's less exports plus imports. And we need about half that amount. So our system is set up to overproduce food. This is what federal subsidies do. They encourage producers to produce more food. And to grow it in places that are environmentally unsustainable and in ways that are environmentally unsustainable. And that's really where the difficulty is. We have a food production system in which 40% of United States corn goes to ethanol for cars. I mean, something that I just can't get my head around. And the rest of it is to feed animals, and we would all be healthier, us and the planet, if we ate less, not necessarily no meat, but certainly less meat. So the waste problem is inextricably linked to the food system as a whole and needs to be understood in the context of the food system as a whole. And yeah, it's great if we don't throw out as much food, but that's not really where the problem is.
Excellent. And so Deborah, coming back and taking it, which for your book is a memoir, and in it, one of the startling things for me was, which links to this whole question of social justice, is in your individual case, you were paid $50 a month for 20 years. What was that? What is that? And what do you want to say about that?
Actually, it's not a problem.
Okay, good. Tell us why it was not a problem. Tell us a little about it.
Because at that time, which was the 60s, 70s, 80s, or 70s, 80s, 90s, I mean, it didn't matter to me. I didn't have a phone. It was actually more than $50 a month because I didn't pay rent. I didn't pay for food.
So you got paid in kind in some ways,
I got paid in kind. I didn't have a phone. I didn't have a car. I didn't have those kinds of concerns and expenses. So it was fine. And also when I did greens, I got a little bit more money than that because it was known that I would have to have my laundry done rather than spend my one day off trying to use one washing machine shared by a whole community. So that was a little more generous.
Excellent.
I think had I stayed, I might have felt differently, because the person I know who followed me as the chef for a long time was paid real money. But at that time, it was fine. It really was.
And early on in the book, you say at some point in your life, you recognize that food could be good every night. And that was your first lesson. Do you want to tell us a little about it?
Sure. I was 16 actually at that time, and my parents had gone to Italy. I mean, they'd gone to Europe on a sabbatical. I suppose they went to Italy too. And they farmed their 4 kids out to various people, and I got to stay with a family who was really a couple who had lived in France. They weren't encumbered with the expenses of children, and they knew how to cook, and it mattered, and food was always good every single night. And that was such a surprise to me because growing up, it wasn't that way particularly.
Excellent. Tom, one of the surprising things for me in your book was that I think it was in Franson's Farm, where you come to see a double solution based not on small farms or exclusively on small farms or large farms, but mid-sized farm. I mean, that's for me was one of the takeaway, and a very intriguing one, and about growing less food targeted more towards the regional system. So could you explain to us this mid-sized farm, the promise of the mid-sized farm, and the promise of a regional food economy?
Well, the mid-sized farm is kind of caught in the middle between, if you're a mid-sized farmer, you can't sell all of your stuff directly to consumers to the farmer's market or through a CSA. You're just too big for that. And you can sell it to wholesale markets, but the wholesale markets are going to give you probably a negative profit margin because they're able to leverage food from Mexico. They're able to buy food from huge farms. And so the price that these whole, sort of Walmart, level markets are going to give you are going to put you out of business. And as a result, when you read about farm losses over the past half century that continue strong today, mid-sized farms are the ones that are going out of business because they don't have a great marketing model. But they also could be the spectacular resource because they're small enough to where biodiversity could actually be the driving force of the farm. That they could grow a bunch of different crops, they could have different crop rotations, They could be ecologically minded in a way that, there's a lot of land under agriculture, that you could put a lot of land under agriculture with mid-sized farms and manage it really sustainably, because there's enough sort of person power. There's not one farmer with 10,000 acres, and you have to simplify things by growing just corn and soybeans. And so I think that one of the challenges for us as a food movement is figuring out how to make mid-sized farms possible, because I think a lot of the salvation is in them. And one thing I'm seeing right now, and I wasn't seeing this when I was writing the book, I was sort of in a book writing bubble, is that there is an amazing movement of young African-American farmers experimenting with co-op models. And, these are folks that didn't grow up with family land, don't have a whole lot of money to buy huge tracts of land. And they're figuring out these economics don't work. And so they're experimenting with cooperative models, which is not a new thing in American agriculture, but it's something that we've gotten away from. And I think moving away from this sort of Jeffersonian myth of the family farmer. Of course, he was a yeoman farmer with a huge team of enslaved people. So I think that was a myth from the get-go. But moving away from that yeoman farmer myth and figuring out new cooperative models for mid-sized farms, I think is going to be crucial going forward.
Just one clarification, Tom, what is a mid-sized farm in the American context?
It really depends on the place. Okay. So in Iowa, where I spend a lot of time in the book, it could be 500 acres or 1,000 acres. Okay. Where I was farming in North Carolina, in the Appalachian Hills of North Carolina, the Appalachian Mountains, a mid-sized farm could be 10 acres. The biggest farm in our area when I was farming in Western North Carolina was, the biggest sort of organic, locally directed farm was 10 acres. And that's a proper mid-sized farm in that area. So it really varies widely by landscape.
So context and ecology and system of food. So Saru, in the conclusion of your book, you give an example, which you consider exemplary, which is statewide fracking ban in New York State. In particular, you point to it as the kind of coalition building we need to do that you referenced early on in your first comments, and the style of movement politics, right? So could you tell us what you find so compelling about the movements that led to that success, and which links to your earlier point that we have to learn from successes in the non-food domain to, in fact, bring it to the food domain?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like we should talk about a more contemporary example if we can.
Yes, yeah.
And just think about this moment. I'll just say briefly, talk about what we're seeing with Black Lives Matter, and then also now with our work in the restaurant industry. But with social movement theory, what we know from the history of the world is that the moments when you see the most transformational change is when the largest numbers of people are engaging in what we call conscientious behavior, confronting those in power. And that word conscientious, I know in the past scares people off, but contending with power is really the only way to change it. As Frederick Douglass says, power concedes nothing without a demand. And power also, and the demand can't be made through a petition or an email. You can't demand that Tyson stop exploiting its workers, or that companies stop, Monsanto stop what it's been doing with seeds for years. You can't demand that without people power, without people demanding that in the streets. And so with Black Lives Matter has been around since 2013. They've been talking about these issues for a while, but the American public really was not supportive, was not open to it. And we didn't see the kinds of dramatic changes that we needed to see. With masses of people in the streets, not only can you demand police reform, you can demand a full restructuring of basically budgeting priorities. A budget is priority. And when cities and states prioritize, or countries prioritize police and military over education and good food, everything we've been talking about, and good jobs, you end up with a police state. You end up with what we have now, which is completely underfunded communities in which police are not acting as safety, people who maintain the peace, as I think what police were intended to, peace officers. They're not maintaining the police. The peace, excuse me. They're policing people, especially people of certain races. So Black people in particular. So I think when you have masses of people, you can demand more. You can demand more structural reform. The larger the number of people engaged in contentious activity, the more structural reform you can ask for. And so I want to bring that to the current moment and what's happening to food workers. I know everybody's been listening and watching to what's happening with workers in meat and poultry processing plants and farm workers. In the case of restaurant workers, I think many of you know that restaurant workers were, before the pandemic, the largest and fastest growing sector of the US economy. 13 million workers, 10 million of them lost their jobs, but most of them were unable to access unemployment insurance, about 60% of them, not because of their immigration status, but because of the sub-minimum wage for tipped workers, which is still $2.13 an hour, and which prevented most of them from accessing benefits because most states told these workers your wages are too low to meet the minimum threshold to qualify for benefits. And that was a slap in the face. It really mobilized a lot of workers who are very angry and who are now being called back to work. And here's the thing we should all be up in arms about. Lots of states are reopening for indoor dining. New York City just opened on Wednesday for 25% indoor dining. The CDC has named restaurants as the only reliable source of getting the coronavirus. They said you're twice as likely to get it as an adult if you eat in a restaurant. And we are asking these workers to enforce social distancing and mask rules with the very same customers from whom they're supposed to get tips to make up their base wage. It makes no sense. They're not going to do it. If you relied on tips, you would not argue with the customer, put on your mask, sit 6 feet apart, because you desperately need those tips to survive. So workers are organizing. And in this moment, to your point about coalition politics, lots of independent restaurants are suddenly joining forces with us, people who disagreed with us. So it's a moment where people rise up together, and that's the point. The moments when you have the most number of people ready to engage in contentious activity, ready to push, that's the change. The change we're looking for right now is for Governor Cuomo in New York to enact a full minimum wage with tips on top, and to workers and employers are calling for that in this public health crisis.
Excellent. Fantastic. Marion, in your book, there's a section where you talk about how the Eat Lancet report got a lot of press and some amount of criticism, but you said we should be paying a little more attention to the Lancet syndemic report, which in fact brings together some of these issues. Tell us a little about what is in the syndemic report that we should be paying attention to, and how it connects, in fact, precisely some of the things Saru was talking about.
Well, first of all, these are two reports that came out in the British medical journal, The Lancet, early in 2019, and they came out a week apart. The first report is called the Eat Lancet report, and it recommended a diet that cut meat intake in half and doubled intake of plant-based food. It got a lot of press. A week later, a report came out with the obscure title of the global syndemic, which I thought was very unfortunate because it's not obvious what it's about. But basically, this is a report that talked about restructuring of society in order to create a food system that is more just, healthier, and better for the planet. And it talked about the barriers to doing that. And it named 3 barriers: weak governance, weak civil society, and a very strong food industry fighting for its capitalistic rights. The power of the report was in talking about the need to strengthen civil society in order to stop corporate capture of government. And it had a great big long laundry list of what we should be doing to the food industry or with the food industry, goals for advocacy, that would stop food industry power and confront the power of the food industry to continue in the way it's been doing. And this involved a long list of ideas, such as keeping the food industry out of public policy, which would be nice, making sure that food industry lobbying is curtailed, stopping food industry marketing, especially to children, mostly things stopping what the food industry is currently doing. And I thought it produced an agenda for advocacy, and that it was unfortunate that the report disappeared in the wake of the E-Lancet report, because it was the first time I had ever seen a major report in a major nutrition, public health, medical, or any other kind of professional journal talk about the need to put some curbs on the food industry in order to create a more just, healthier, and environmentally sensitive food system. So I teach those reports. I think they're really important.
Excellent. And for those of us, I'm just following the chat. For the audience, if you folks have questions for these authors, please put it in the chat, and I'm following it, and I can ask these questions. I'm going to come back to Deborah, in fact, to all of you. One of the questions to think about is, what was the most surprising thing you learned in writing this book?
Wow.
For you, Deborah?
Well, for me, it was because it really took a lot of work to find that, what the book was about, really. So what was most surprising is that the most memorable meals are about people, not about menus. And that's it in short, I would say.
Excellent. Tom?
Going into the writing of it, I knew that there were strong social movements in the Central Valley and also in the Corn Belt for people sort of defending their right to have good water, good wages, decent air. But I was surprised at just how strong they were, you know, particularly in the Central Valley, but also in Iowa. And I just came to the realization that we should all be their allies, because when they are fighting for water that's not poisonous and for decent wages, for farm work or for meatpacking work, they're fighting for a food system that is not going to be as destructive for all of us. If we can make the Central Valley into a livable place, if we can make the Corn Belt into a livable place, the food system is going to improve dramatically. So we should all be allies of these groups, is the thing that I took away. That's sort of the thing that surprised me.
Excellent. Saru?
Yeah, I guess what surprised me was that it was hard to find examples of the kind of organizing that I'm talking about in the different segments of food justice reform or food reform, which to me just speaks to the need for, I mean, I'm biased, but organizing training and organizing for people who work on different aspects of food. I feel like the broad, there's not a lot of kind of unity among people in working on different aspects of food to come together and say, our common, what brings us together is not just our love of food and our hope for a reformed food system, but our mission that we need to dismantle corporate control of our democracy. Like it is not articulated in that way across the different aspects of food. And I feel like if it were, then it would be much clearer that we have a common target we need to organize together, you know, for the sake of the animals and the planet and the people across all the different issues. What unites us is not just our love of food and our hope and dream for a sustainable food system, but the fact that there are people responsible, that there are entities and people responsible for it not being a sustainable food system right now. We have to recognize that, name it, and then organize to change it. That is what we need.
Excellent. In the areas where you found the biggest gap in terms of advocacy work, what were some of those areas, would you say?
Well, I mean, I don't want to name I just would say, I think there's a lot of beautiful work happening from, community food systems and food, in gardens, and so many amazing things happening. But I just, it's not organizing. Organizing, and let me just say the definition of organizing, it's people with limited means and power uniting collectively to take direct action to target those in power contentiously to demand change in the power structure and the situation of their lives. So creating alternative seed banks and gardens are incredibly important, amazing, wonderful, important things. And we absolutely need to be coming together across different aspects of food reform to also be engaging and organizing. Otherwise, we won't get system change. We'll get, wonderful programs and garden seed banks.
Excellent. Marion? What was surprising? Because this is a new kind of a book for you, isn't it?
Yeah, this is a really tiny book. It's short, and for me, it was very challenging to try to summarize everything that I've written about over the last 20 years in something that's as short as this. It was very challenging. I think the big surprise, the book was in press when the pandemic hit. And the big surprise to me was how extraordinarily relevant it is to everything that's happening now, that the issues that I was discussing in answer to Carrie Truman's questions were completely relevant to what's happening to the pandemic. I was very fortunate that during the page proof stage, there was a blank page and I got to write about that. I was really happy about being able to squeeze that in the last minute. But the relevance of the issues that that all of us have been discussing on this panel are taken up in the various questions in this book in a very, very short format. And I was amazed that I could do it.
Good. On that note, that's lovely. We have less than 1 minute. Anyone wants to express some final thoughts on this panel?
I'll just say, I think the pandemic revealed blatantly everything that was wrong with our food system and our democracy. And it's time for all of us to recognize that and not demand that we go back to the way things were, but rather demand an entirely new system, regardless of who becomes president.
And that's like the Greek word apocalypse, which is to reveal, in fact. And that's what exactly this apocalypse is doing to our food system, is revealing. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Marion. Thank you, Deborah. Thank you, Saru. And thank you, Tom. I've really enjoyed reading the books. And for the audience, you can go to the Buy Books link and directly order the books. Thank you all for giving us your Sunday. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
See you all.